All right. Welcome back, everybody. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling the stages of human life, and we've got this awesome knowledge organizer to guide
A
us.
knowledge organizer.
Yeah, it's like it's this science document. But it's not just your typical list of milestones. This thing maps out the whole human timeline.
Oh, wow. Okay, so like from birth to death.
Exactly. But it goes deeper than that. We're not just going to hit the highlights. We're talking about the how, the when, the nitty-gritty details of how humans change over time.
That sounds really cool. I'm curious to see what this timeline says about individual differences. Because we all know the basic categories, right? Infant, toddler, child, all that. But the reality is messier than that, isn't it?
Right. And this timeline gets that. It's laid out visually
Hmm.
from age 0 to 90, with those categories marked along the way. But it's not just a straight line. There are all these little details that really make you think. Like, oh, here's one. It mentions that bones start weakening after age 50. Isn't that like a normal part of aging?
It is. But it's more complicated than just saying bones get weaker, right? What happens after 50 is that you start to see a gradual decline in bone density.
Bone density. So, like, our bones get less dense.
Exactly. And it's not just about getting shorter, which can happen. This decrease in bone density is linked to things like osteoporosis and a higher risk of fractures. And what's interesting is that while age is definitely a factor, so are things like diet, exercise, and even your genes.
Wait, so it's not an inevitable decline. You can actually do things to help your bones age better.
Absolutely. That's where the whole interplay of biology and personal choice comes in. The timeline points out milestones that are driven purely by choice, like learning to ride a bike, for example. But even with something like bone density, where biology is definitely at play, we still have some agency, you know? What we do, what we eat, how we live it, all matters.
That's good to hear. Now, speaking of biology, driving things, there's a whole section here on puberty. I've always been kind of fascinated by the whole timing of puberty, you know? Is it really as predictable as we think?
Well, puberty is definitely hormone-driven. Those chemical messengers in our bodies trigger this whole cascade of changes. But even though we talk about an average age for, say, girls starting their periods,
Which this timeline puts it around 12.
right, around 12. But there's a huge range of what's considered normal. Some girls start earlier, some later, and it's all perfectly fine.
Makes sense. Now, the timeline also mentions that these hormones can cause mood swings. Is that really all it is to being a teenager? Just like hormones running wild?
Well, it's not quite that simple. It's true that specific hormones, mainly estrogen and testosterone, are surging during puberty. But those hormones have a huge impact on brain development, too. The parts of the brain responsible for emotional regulation and impulse control, those are still maturing during puberty.
Oh, so that's why teenagers can be so...
Emotionally intense.
Yes, exactly.
Exactly. It's like a double whammy. You've got these surging hormones, and at the same time, the brain is still under construction. And then you add on all the social and emotional changes of adolescence, like figuring out who you are, dealing with relationships, peer pressure, all that. It's no wonder this stage of life can feel like a roller coaster.
It totally is. Now, let's talk about some of those physical changes during puberty. The timeline mentions things like breast development, body hair, growth spurts. Oh, and it even uses this term Tanner stages, which I've never heard of.
Have you not? Well, the Tanner stages are just a standardized way to describe the progression of puberty. It's like a more detailed way to look at those physical changes, which is helpful for doctors and researchers who are tracking development. So, for example, instead of just saying pubic hair develops, the Tanner stages break down pubic hair growth into 5 distinct stages.
5 stages. Wow, that's way more detailed than I ever imagined.
Right. So we've got this whole biological roadmap playing out during puberty, but then the timeline also mentions specific ages for other milestones, like sitting upright at 6 months, learning to read around 5 or 6, driving a car at 17. What do you think? Is that biology setting the stage and society laying down the rules?
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me, right? Like, our biology determines when we're physically capable of doing certain things, but when we're actually allowed to do them, that's often a social or legal decision.
Exactly. Think about driving. Biologically, a 15-year-old might have all the physical skills to drive, but society has decided that, 16 or 17 is a safer, more responsible age to start.
Yeah, for sure. It's amazing how those two factors, biology and society, are constantly interacting and shaping our lives. So after looking at this human timeline with all its complexity and variations, what's the big takeaway for our listeners today?
I think the biggest takeaway is that While biology gives us this general framework, human development is incredibly diverse. We hit milestones at different times, we have unique experiences, and we're shaped by this complex web of both biological and social factors.
It really makes you appreciate the individuality of the human experience, doesn't it?
It really does. And that brings us to something for you all to think about. If you could add a personal milestone to this scientific timeline, one that goes beyond those typical markers, what would it be and why? Think about it. What event, what moment in your life would you mark on the human timeline, and what makes it significant to you?
I love that. Such a great question to ponder. All right, everyone, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the human timeline. It's been illuminating.
It has. Thanks for having me.
Until next time, keep exploring.